You're standing in a cornfield on a crisp autumn morning, operating a combine harvester worth more than your house. The machine is humming along, doing what it was designed to do, separating grain from chaff with mechanical precision. Then, in a split second, something goes wrong. The feeder house door, a massive steel component that weighs over 200 pounds, suddenly slams shut with the force of a car crash. And your hand? It's caught right in the middle. This isn't a hypothetical nightmare. This happened to 89 real farmers across America, and the company that built these machines knew about the deadly flaw for years but did almost nothing to stop it. Before we dive into this disturbing story that the agricultural industry tried to bury, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications because we're uncovering stories that big corporations don't want you to know about. International Harvester was once an American icon, a name that defined farming for generations. Founded in the early 1900s, the company built tractors, combines, and equipment that helped feed the world. By the 1970s and 80s, their red machines were everywhere, from family farms in Iowa to massive operations in California. Farmers trusted the brand because International Harvester had earned that trust over decades. But that trust was about to be shattered in the most brutal way imaginable. The company introduced a line of combine harvesters that featured a design element that seemed innovative at the time, a hydraulically operated feeder house door. This door was positioned at the front of the combine where crop material entered the machine. It needed to open for maintenance, adjustments, and clearing blockages, which happened frequently during harvest. The hydraulic system meant the door could be opened and closed with the flip of a switch, no manual lifting required. Sounds convenient, right? But hidden within this convenience was a ticking time bomb that would destroy lives. The problem was simple but devastating. The hydraulic system that controlled the feeder house door had no safety mechanism to prevent it from closing unexpectedly. None. No redundant valve, no mechanical lock, no warning system. If there was a pressure surge in the hydraulic system, which could happen for various reasons, including normal vibrations from the machine's operation, yet the door could slam shut without warning. And because the door was positioned exactly where farmers needed to reach in to clear crop blockages or make adjustments, their hands and arms were constantly in the danger zone. Imagine working on a machine where a 200-pound steel door can close on you at any moment, with enough force to crush bone like it's a soda can. That was the reality for thousands of farmers who bought these combines. The force wasn't gentle, it wasn't a pinch. Hydraulic systems operate at pressures of 2,000 pounds per square inch or more. When that door closed on someone, it closed with the kind of force normally reserved for industrial presses. The first incidents started appearing in the late 1970s, shortly after these combines hit the market. A farmer in Nebraska reached into the feeder house to clear a blockage of wet straw, a routine task he'd done 1,000 times before on older machines. The door closed on his hand, severing 3 fingers instantly. He was rushed to the hospital, but the damage was done. His farming career, which had spanned 3 generations of his family, was effectively over. He couldn't operate equipment with one hand. He couldn't do the physical labor that farming demanded. His entire livelihood was destroyed in a fraction of a second. And here's the kicker. International Harvester was notified about this incident. The dealer who sold him the combine filed a report. The company knew that their design had just destroyed a man's hand. But instead of issuing a recall or even a safety bulletin, they did virtually nothing. They treated it as an isolated incident, an anomaly, bad luck. Except it wasn't isolated at all. It was the beginning of a pattern that would repeat itself dozens and dozens of times. Over the next several years, similar incidents kept happening with disturbing regularity. A farmer in Kansas lost 4 fingers. Another in Missouri had his entire hand crushed so severely that amputation was the only option. A father and son operation in Illinois saw the son's arm broken in 3 places when the door closed on him mid-forearm. The stories were horrifying, and they all followed the same script. The farmer would be doing routine maintenance or clearing a blockage. The feeder house door would be open. Then, without any warning, without any input from the operator, the door would slam shut. Even the force was so immense that victims described hearing their own bones snap before they felt the pain. Many went into shock immediately. Those working alone in remote fields faced an additional nightmare, trying to free themselves from the machine while in excruciating pain, then driving themselves to get help before they bled out. Some farmers were trapped for hours before help arrived. The psychological trauma of these incidents was almost as devastating as the physical injuries. Now, you might be wondering how International Harvester responded to these mounting injuries. Surely, once they had multiple reports of the same type of injury occurring on the same model of equipment, they would take action, right? Here's where the story gets even darker. My internal documents that later came to light during legal proceedings showed that the company was absolutely aware of the problem. Dealers were filing reports. Farmers were calling in complaints. The pattern was unmistakable. But International Harvester made a calculated business decision. They determined that issuing a recall or redesigning the hydraulic system would be too expensive. They ran the numbers and decided that it was cheaper to deal with lawsuits from injured farmers than to fix every machine in the field. Let that sink in for a moment. They knew people were losing fingers, hands, and arms. They knew the design was defective, and they chose profit over safety. This wasn't negligence. This was a conscious choice to value money over human lives and livelihoods. The dealers who sold these machines were in an impossible position. As many of them knew about the defect because they were hearing directly from their customers who'd been injured or who'd had close calls. Some dealers, to their credit, tried to warn new buyers. They'd tell farmers to be extremely careful around the feeder house door, to never reach in without first shutting down the entire machine, to treat the door like it was spring-loaded and ready to kill you. But these warnings weren't standardized, and they weren't nearly enough. Other dealers, either unaware of the full scope of the problem or unwilling to jeopardize sales, said nothing. They'd hand over the keys to a $60,000 combine and send the farmer on his way without mentioning that the machine had a design flaw that could cost him his hand. Some dealers did try to jury-rig solutions, like installing manual pins that could lock the door open, but these modifications weren't approved by International Harvester, and they voided warranties. Farmers were caught in a nightmare scenario where the machine they'd mortgaged their farm to buy could maim them at any moment. By the mid-1980s, the injury count had climbed to 89 documented cases. 89 farmers who'd lost fingers, hands, or suffered severe crush injuries. And those were just the documented cases, the ones that made it into official reports or lawsuits. How many more close calls happened that were never reported? How many farmers had the door close on them, but managed to pull their hand away at the last possible second? How many minor injuries occurred where the farmer just bandaged himself up and went back to work because harvest doesn't wait and he couldn't afford downtime? The real number of people put at risk was certainly much higher. Each of those 89 documented cases represented a family devastated, a livelihood destroyed, and years of medical procedures and rehabilitation. Many of the victims required multiple surgeries to reconstruct mangled hands. Some never regained full use of their injured limbs. The medical bills alone were staggering, and this was before the era of widespread health insurance coverage for farmers. The legal battles that eventually erupted were fierce. Injured farmers started suing International Harvester, and as more cases piled up, the pattern became undeniable. Lawyers obtained internal company documents through discovery that showed the company had knowledge of the defect years before they took meaningful action. Testimony from engineers revealed that alternative designs with safety features had been proposed but rejected as too costly. The evidence painted a damning picture of a corporation that prioritized its bottom line over customer safety. Juries were not sympathetic. In several cases, they awarded not just compensatory damages to cover medical bills and lost income, but also punitive damages designed to punish the company for its reckless behavior. One case in Iowa resulted in a multi-million-dollar verdict when the jury heard testimony about how many internal reports the company had received before the plaintiff lost 3 fingers. The message from these juries was clear. If you know about a deadly defect and you choose to do nothing, you're going to pay. Eventually, under pressure from mounting lawsuits and negative publicity, International Harvester did issue a retrofit kit for the affected combines. This kit included a safety valve that would prevent the accidental closure of the feeder house door and a mechanical lock that could be engaged when someone needed to work near the opening. It was exactly the kind of fix that should have been included from day one. But by the time this retrofit was rolled out, 89 farmers had already paid the price for the company's negligence. And even then, the retrofit wasn't automatic. Farmers had to bring their combines in to have the kit installed, and many never got the word or couldn't afford the downtime during critical harvest periods. So even after a solution existed, there were still dangerous machines operating in fields across the country. International Harvester also didn't admit any wrongdoing. They framed the retrofit as a product improvement rather than a safety recall, trying to protect themselves from additional liability. The aftermath of this scandal went beyond the individual victims. International Harvester's reputation took a massive hit among the farming community. Trust, once broken, is incredibly hard to rebuild, especially in tight-knit rural communities where word travels fast. Farmers started looking at other brands, and International Harvester was already struggling financially due to other business problems. As the company eventually collapsed and was absorbed by other agricultural equipment manufacturers. While it's impossible to say exactly how much the feeder house door scandal contributed to the company's downfall, it certainly didn't help. The 89 victims and their families were left to pick up the pieces of their lives. Many had to leave farming entirely because they could no longer perform the physical work. Some sank into depression, watching their family farms get sold off because they couldn't operate them anymore. The ripple effects touched entire communities as productive farms went under, and families struggled with medical debt and disability. So, what are the lessons from this tragic chapter in American agricultural history? First, it's a stark reminder that corporate accountability matters. When companies know about defects and choose to hide them or ignore them, people get hurt. The system of lawsuits and legal liability exists precisely to give victims recourse and to punish companies that put profit over safety. Second, it shows the importance of regulatory oversight in industries where dangerous machinery is involved. While farming equipment isn't regulated as heavily as, say, automobiles, perhaps it should be. Farmers deserve the same safety protections as any other workers. Third, this story highlights the vulnerability of farmers, who often work alone with dangerous equipment and who face intense economic pressure to keep working, even when conditions are unsafe. The pressure to get the harvest in, to keep the farm running, to avoid costly downtime, that pressure led many farmers to take risks they shouldn't have had to take. And finally, this is a story about the human cost of negligence. Behind each of those 89 cases was a real person with dreams, responsibilities, and families who depended on them. The International Harvester feeder house door scandal isn't just ancient history. It's a cautionary tale that remains relevant today. Agricultural equipment is more complex than ever, with computerized systems and automated functions that can fail in unexpected ways. Farmers still work with dangerous machinery every single day, often in isolated conditions where help isn't immediately available. The question we should be asking is, has the industry truly learned from disasters like this one? Are modern equipment manufacturers building safety into their designs from the ground up? Or are they still making cost-benefit calculations about whether it's cheaper to pay lawsuits than to engineer better safety features? The answer, unfortunately, is mixed. While safety has generally improved and modern equipment does include more safeguards, there are still incidents of preventable injuries occurring because a manufacturer cut corners or failed to adequately warn users about known risks. If you're someone who works in agriculture or knows farmers, this story should resonate deeply. It's a reminder to never trust that equipment is safe just because it's new or because it comes from a reputable brand. Always read safety manuals, always follow lockout procedures when doing maintenance. Why? And never assume that a company has your best interests at heart. Your safety is ultimately your responsibility, but manufacturers and dealers have a legal and moral obligation to provide equipment that doesn't have hidden deadly flaws. When they fail in that obligation, they need to be held accountable through every means available, whether that's lawsuits, regulatory action, or public exposure of their negligence. The 89 farmers who lost fingers and hands to International Harvester's defective combines deserve to have their stories told, not just as cautionary tales, but as calls to action for better safety standards across the entire agricultural industry. This has been the disturbing true story of how one of America's most trusted farm equipment manufacturers knowingly sold defective combines that crushed 89 farmers' hands, and how dealers stayed silent about the problem for years while more victims piled up. It's a story about corporate greed, regulatory failure, and the real human cost of putting profits before people. If this story made you angry, good. That anger is justified. Channel it into demanding better from the companies that make the tools we rely on every day. Make sure you're subscribed because we're going to keep bringing you stories like this. Stories that expose the truth behind corporate negligence and hold powerful companies accountable. Share this video with anyone who works in agriculture or who cares about worker safety. Like these stories need to be told, and the lessons need to be remembered. Stay safe out there. The farming community's response to this tragedy wasn't just legal action and brand abandonment. It sparked a broader conversation about worker rights and safety standards that had been largely ignored in rural America. For decades, farming had been treated differently from other industries. Factory workers had OSHA regulations, construction crews had safety standards, but farmers were largely left to fend for themselves. The International Harvester scandal helped change that perception, at least gradually. Advocacy groups began forming to push for better equipment standards and more rigorous safety testing before machinery was released to market. These organizations worked to educate farmers about their rights and to pressure manufacturers into being more transparent about known risks. The movement wasn't as dramatic as some industrial safety reforms, but it represented a real shift in how the farming community viewed safety. Farmers started demanding better, and some manufacturers began to listen, understanding that ignoring safety concerns would damage their reputation and bottom line. One fascinating aspect of this story is how word of mouth functioned in the pre-internet era. Information about the feeder house door defect spread through farmer networks, at feed stores, at agricultural co-ops, and at county extension offices. Even without social media or email, farmers talked to each other, and warnings about dangerous equipment traveled from person to person. Some of the dealers who cared about their customers became informal safety ambassadors, calling farmers who'd bought these combines to warn them about the danger. These relationships between dealers and farming families often went back generations, and when a dealer knew his customer's life could be at risk, he felt a personal obligation to reach out. This human element of the story often gets lost when we focus on the corporate negligence. But it's important to remember that there were good people working within the system who tried to do the right thing even when their employers weren't. Their efforts likely saved lives by encouraging farmers to be more cautious around the feeder house door, even before the retrofit kit became available. The engineering community also grappled with the lessons from this scandal. Agricultural equipment designers began discussing the case in training programs and professional development courses as an example of what happens when cost considerations override safety engineering principles. Design standards gradually improved across the industry as manufacturers realized that cutting corners on safety could have catastrophic consequences for their business reputation. Modern combine harvesters now include multiple redundant safety systems for any component that could cause serious injury. Hydraulic systems have relief valves, mechanical locks, and in many cases, electronic sensors that detect when a person is in a dangerous area. The feeder house door on today's combines often includes proximity sensors that shut down the hydraulic system if someone gets too close. These aren't features that were added because they were trendy or because someone thought they might be nice to have. They exist because lessons were learned from the blood and suffering of farmers like those 89 victims. Every safety feature represents a tragedy that was prevented, and we owe that to the farmers who fought for accountability. The legal precedent established by the International Harvester cases also extended beyond agricultural equipment. Product liability law in America was significantly shaped by agricultural machinery cases because they provided such clear examples of manufacturers knowing about defects and choosing to ignore them. Lawyers who worked on these cases went on to take on defective product cases in other industries, using the same discovery techniques and legal arguments. The evidence that internal company documents could prove knowledge of defects became standard practice in product liability litigation. Without these pioneering agricultural equipment cases, the legal landscape around product safety might look very different today. It's one of those instances where rural America's struggles helped establish protections that eventually benefited everyone, even though the farming community didn't always get credit for it. For the survivors of these incidents, life after injury was a journey of adaptation and perseverance. Many farmers learned to operate equipment with prosthetics or adapted machinery to work with their physical limitations. Some became advocates themselves, traveling to agricultural conferences and farm shows to tell their stories and educate other farmers about safety. Their willingness to relive their trauma publicly, to show their injured hands to audiences, to describe in graphic detail what happened to them, required extraordinary courage. These advocates didn't do it for compensation or publicity. They did it because they didn't want anyone else to experience what they'd been through. Their voices became part of the safety movement, giving it authenticity and emotional weight that no regulatory document could match. When a farmer who lost 3 fingers stood up and told his story, other farmers listened in a way they might not have to a safety consultant or engineer. Peer testimony carries weight in close-knit communities. The manufacturer's response to increased safety demands also reveals something interesting about how industries evolve. Once lawsuits started piling up and the legal liability became clear, equipment manufacturers found that improving safety actually wasn't as expensive as they'd initially calculated. When engineers are tasked with solving a safety problem rather than being told to cut costs, they often find elegant solutions that add minimal expense to production. The hydraulic relief valves and mechanical locks that eventually became standard on feeder house doors cost only a fraction of what the early lawsuits cost International Harvester. This pattern has repeated itself throughout industrial history. Companies resist safety improvements until legal and financial pressure forces them to implement what they claim would be too expensive. Then they implement the changes and discover they weren't as costly as feared. It's a frustrating dynamic that suggests many safety improvements could happen faster if companies had the right incentives from the start. The families of injured farmers also had to navigate the psychological and financial aftermath. Medical bills for reconstructive surgery on mangled hands could total hundreds of thousands of dollars. Multiple surgeries were often needed, spread over years, with no guarantee that full function would be restored. Insurance coverage was spotty at best for many farms, and disability benefits for self-employed farmers were much less comprehensive than they are today. Families had to make gut-wrenching decisions about whether to continue pursuing multiple surgeries that might only marginally improve function, or to accept the permanent injury and move forward. Some farmers received large lawsuit settlements, but the money came years after the injury, and there's no price that can compensate for losing the use of your dominant hand. The financial settlements also created complicated feelings. Some victims felt that accepting money was like accepting compensation for their suffering, as if the injury could somehow be redeemed through dollars. Others felt bitter that it took money to get the company to care about safety, that no amount of injury reports had moved them until lawsuits started costing them. These psychological complexities rarely appear in legal documents, but they shape the lives of survivors and their families profoundly. As time passed and International Harvester faded from the farming landscape, the memory of the feeder house door scandal began to fade as well. Younger farmers who started operating equipment after the company's equipment was phased out might have never heard the story. This is one reason why telling these stories remains important decades later. Institutional memory is fragile, especially in industries where generational knowledge transfer happens through word of mouth and hands-on experience. If the story of the feeder house door becomes just a vague myth rather than a clearly remembered cautionary tale, we risk repeating similar patterns with new equipment manufacturers and new products. History doesn't repeat itself, but as the saying goes, it often rhymes. The specific hydraulic system and the specific combine design are long gone, but the underlying dynamic of cost-benefit analysis trumping safety considerations continues to this day in various forms. Today's farmers and agricultural workers should take this story as a powerful reminder to never fully trust that any piece of equipment is completely safe, no matter how modern or how reputable the manufacturer. Complacency is dangerous in agriculture. Every piece of machinery deserves respect, careful handling, and adherence to safety procedures. Read the manuals even if you've operated similar equipment before. Different machines have different quirks and different hazard points. Talk to other farmers about their experiences with equipment. Join farmer groups online or in person where safety concerns can be discussed openly. And if you discover a potential safety issue with equipment you own, report it. Report it to the manufacturer, report it to dealer networks, and tell other farmers. Your report might be the one that identifies a pattern before dozens of people get hurt. The 89 farmers who suffered in the International Harvester case didn't choose to become crusaders for safety, but their experience created an obligation for all of us to take safety seriously and to never assume that companies have already considered and solved every hazard. Thank you for watching this deep dive into one of the darker chapters of American agricultural history. The story of the feeder house door reminds us that even trusted institutions can fail us, that profit motives can override human welfare, and that accountability has to come from somewhere, whether that's the legal system, regulatory agencies, or the collective voice of consumers demanding better. If you found this story as compelling and troubling as I did, please share it with others. Send it to the farmers you know. Send it to anyone interested in industrial safety or consumer protection. Help keep this story and its lessons alive. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel because we're dedicated to uncovering these hidden histories and corporate scandals that shape our world in ways most people never realize. Your subscription helps us continue this work of investigation and storytelling. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next video. Stay safe, and remember, your safety is worth fighting for.